Hello and welcome to the Of Interest podcast. I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz. It's no secret that housing plays a massive role in the New Zealand economy, which we sometimes describe as a housing market with bits tacked on. According to Statistics New Zealand, housing and land values comprise more than half our household net worth. Property is a key area of investment for New Zealanders, with Prime Minister Christopher Luxon's well-publicised ownership of 7 homes emphasising this. New Zealand banks have 70% of their total lending exposure in the property sector, and the property industry is a key advertiser in New Zealand media and donated more money to political parties ahead of last year's election than any other industry. Whilst home ownership remains a Kiwi dream, home ownership rates have been falling, rents rising, the social housing waitlist growing, and the quality of many New Zealand homes is often called into question. Another country with a property obsession is our near neighbour, Australia. Our guest for this episode is Cameron Murray, the Chief Economist at Fresh Economic Thinking over in Australia, and the author of a new book called The Great Housing Hijack. Hi Cameron, and welcome to the Of Interest podcast.
G'day Gareth, thanks for having me.
Look, before we jump into it, boots and all, perhaps you could just tell our listeners a bit about your experiences in and around the property sector, because you've done quite a bit.
Yeah, so I guess it was actually my dad that probably sparked my interest in property. He was always investing, building houses, buying and selling, and he essentially encouraged me and my siblings to invest in property. I was only 19 at the time, and so he helped us all get invested in property, trying to secure our financial future. And that was just before the 2000s boom in Australia. And I was studying engineering at university, and I realized, hang on a minute, there's so much money in property. What am I doing here trying to become an engineer when I should be involved in the property market? So I got rid of the engineering, decided I'd be a real estate agent, see how that went. Was terrible at that. A failed real estate agent, I say. But the market still interested me. So I actually did a degree called property economics, which is about valuation and development. And when I graduated, I got a position at FKP, which was a listed property developer doing residential, industrial, retirement villages and things like that. So I was a sort of assistant cadet person there, trying to get my hands involved in everything and learn what I could. I lasted there a while, ended up working for an industrial developer shortly after. During that time, I was buying and selling property as well, but also renting my own home. So I could actually feel that tension, I think, that is at the heart of the property market of, when rents go up, that's great with my investor hat on, but terrible with my tenant hat on. So I actually lived that experience for many years. A long story short, the last 4 years I've been studying property and specifically the economics of housing supply for the last 4 years at the University of Sydney. And so that's sort of, the book is the result of a lot of that experience and that last 4 years of research. And in the last few months, I've started my own think tank, Fresh Economic Thinking. That's my story, Gareth.
Great, thanks. That's great background for us. Look, I mean, obviously, your focus in the book is clearly on the Australian housing market. New Zealand gets a few mentions. How similar or different do you see the two countries' housing markets and indeed attitudes towards housing?
Extremely similar. I think culturally very similar in terms of the attitude to housing. You guys have the joke you're in a housing market with an economy attached, and in Australia we call ourselves the houses and holes economy. It's either you build houses or you dig stuff out of the ground. So I think that's very similar, but also I think financially we're financially and economically tied together as well because of the relocation of people. So living in New Zealand and Australia are substitutes for many people at the right price. So when a town in Australia is booming, Kiwis come over to work there, and when it's crashing, they move back. And so there's an economic link as well. But I would say Canada is very similar as well. Much of the United States is very similar. The UK is very similar. And to be honest, once you even reach out to the Asian countries, you got Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, India, housing market is pretty important everywhere, actually, when you think about it. And we often compare just to those peer countries, those Commonwealth countries. Um, but if we compare globally, we actually get a very different picture as well in terms of what's affordable, what's a quality home, what's a decent rate of home ownership, and things like that. So it's always good to zoom out as well.
So look, Cameron, the title, The Great Housing Hijack. Now, I mean, I've read the book, but obviously our listeners probably haven't. Hopefully, some of them will. But what is the Great Housing Hijack?
Yeah, I struggled for a long time, honestly, Gareth, to come up with a way of communicating the main message. But I think the housing hijack is not too bad. Uh, it, it essentially describes the state of the public debate in housing, that there are so many vested interests, so many different groups and hobby horses that have lobbied professionally or not for many decades, that it is very hard to have a straight conversation about housing in a public forum. Um, so that is the housing hijack. We have property owners, landlord lobby groups saying, well, if you regulate rents, that's bad for tenants, right? How can it be bad for tenants? I mean, it's your interest to have higher rents. Of course, you're going to say that. But they have spent a lot of time and energy crafting that message. We have the media whose interest is in selling clicks, and they don't want a coherent view of property markets. They just want headlines. Oh, record suburb, price here. Oh, this suburb's falling fast. Oh, this here. Oh, best time for investors. Oh, worst time for investors. How do you make sense of what's really happening if all you see are headlines in the media of the most extreme cherry-picked examples, each week of what's happening, and then you have the interest groups being represented? And even when you get into academia, you find a lot of the game in academia is not about offering a coherent view of the market, but almost entertaining each other with more obscure niche problems that the market throws up at you. And so the housing hijack is all about this, what I call in the book, the cheer squad, these noisy people on the sideline distracting us from the game of housing, and what, rather than understanding the plays and the strategy of the game, we're getting distracted by the noise of the cheer squad. So that's sort of the analogy. It's not very perfect, but it's my attempt to convey that message.
Okay. And I mean, what, in your view, should we want from housing or the housing market from a public policy perspective?
Well, I think that's the right question to ask, Gareth, because oftentimes we have the debate where we jump to a conclusion before we've identified a problem. And one way to put it is this: home ownership in Australia is 66%. I think it's about 65% in New Zealand.
Yep.
That means for 2/3 of households, the market is fine, right? They've got a home. If it goes up in value, that's great. If they move and they rent it, that's great. So for most households, the market is working fine. So when we say things like, oh, there's a housing crisis, well, it's not a crisis for everyone, actually. For the landlords, it's called a rental income boom, right? And for those homeowners, it's called an asset price boom. So who is it not working for? Who is the crisis not working for? Well, the way to sort of put it is that about 30% of households rent in the private market. Maybe about half of them are really being squeezed, right? Half of them are probably young professionals. They're moving to new towns. They're renting nice places. They got great jobs. That's great. But half of those renters, so we're talking sort of 15% of households, they're the ones that get squeezed when rents adjust quickly. They're the ones that are potential first home buyers in the coming years who feel like that's getting out of reach. And so any solution has to trade off politically. How do we help that 10 or 15% of people without destroying the value of everybody else's biggest asset on their balance sheet? And that is sort of the heart of the problem. And I called the trade-off economically the symmetry of property markets, right? Every win for a renter is a loss for a landlord. Every win for a first home buyer is a seller of a home who sold at the wrong time or underpriced their property. So this is the political dilemma, I think, at the heart of the housing market. And when we talk in the press, mostly we all know what the crisis is. But when I ask people, I get different answers, actually. I don't know if you remember the part of the book. I surveyed my Twitter followers and I said, what's wrong with the housing market? And they just came up with all different answers. Let me just tell you some.
Yeah. That's
some
a very
said,
entertaining part of the book too. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me just tell you some, because I think this will resonate with listeners. Some people would say, there's too much density in the suburbs. It's overdevelopment. And others will say, there's not enough density in the suburbs. Some people will say, we must tax property more. Others say, well, there's too many taxes on property. Some say there's too many investors buying. Others say we need more investors for the rental market. I mean, it can't be all of that, right? We need to agree what the problem is if we want to find a solution. Otherwise, we're just, enjoying arguing with each other without actually getting to the heart of the problem.
Okay, that's really interesting, and we'll swing back round to those issues a little later on. But I pick up on a few other points first. I thought one of the things that I found really interesting in your book is the historical context you have. So, and you talk about, you highlight the post-World War II golden age, I guess, from end of World War II up until the mid-1970s. But you also highlight that through the history of housing, it's something of an outlier in terms of how things were, home ownership rising, etc. in that time period. Given this, we're always comparing ourselves now in contemporary times to that boom period and how things have got worse. Mm-hmm. Should we perhaps just be looking back on that as a golden period and as an outlier period? Are we really going to get back there?
That's a good question. I think we've got to, acknowledge that was an unusual period in history. And I think where we go wrong in the state of the current debate is we think that it's not an unusual history. We actually impose this idea, this assumption that was the normal outcome of history. And therefore, property markets today should be delivering this abnormal outcome if we just let them rip, right? But if we go back any time in the 200 years before, my favorite quote is this, and maybe the listeners can guess who said it. This is from a visitor to Sydney on their first day. This is what they wrote on their diary. The number of large houses just finished and others building is truly surprising. Nevertheless, everyone complains of the high rents and difficulty in procuring a house. Okay, who was that visitor to Sydney? Well, that was Charles Darwin in January 1836. And of all the things he could write about, all the animals in the country, he decided, the strangest thing about this country is everyone seems rich. There's new houses going up everywhere, but they complain about high rents and prices. And of course, the population of New South Wales was 20,000 back then. And so that's really, for me, that is just so powerful in terms of grounding our expectations, right? There were no federal taxes. There was no federal government. There were no planning regulations. So what was it that could be the case then that is the case now? We had, for example, numerous parliamentary inquiries into rising rents in 1911 and 1939 and pretty much every property cycle in the last century. And yet today we kind of impose this assumption that this is something abnormal that property markets do. If only we could get back to the golden age. Well, that was abnormal because we had rent controls through the Second World War that took decades to unwind. And yet today, people are very averse to rent controls. But we know historically, if you regulate the rent, landlords will sell because they can get better returns elsewhere and home ownership will rise. But that's not part of the debate. We know that we had the biggest wave of public housing in history, not just in Australia, but globally. And in fact, many countries in Europe rebuilding after the Second World War said, we can't let the private market build homes because they won't do it fast enough. We need to do it so fast that you won't make money building homes. It'll be completely uneconomical. So we just have to do it. Yeah, okay, we could do those things again today if we wanted, but they're not part of the public debate. And so I think this era of confusing the golden age of huge public intervention in housing with the normal outcome of property markets is one of those big mistakes I'd like to correct with this book.
You also refer to 5 housing market equilibria. Might be quite useful if you just talk us through the 5 and how they interact in your view.
Okay, terrific. So, one section of the book is devoted to these 5 equilibria. And the reason for doing that is to give us an economic ground truth, in a way, before we start assessing, what happens with a tax change? What happens with zoning? What about immigration? What about these other questions? So there's no point talking about them unless you can agree on what the major economic forces are in the property market. And economists have this idea called equilibrium. And equilibrium is a market outcome of people who have options to trade and swap, in where after enough trades and swaps, there's no way to make yourself better off. And I use the analogy of supermarket checkouts. If you've got 2 supermarket checkouts and there's a queue in each one, and one queue has 2 people and one queue has 10 people, that's not an equilibrium because people can swap queues, they can trade. The person who's 10th can swatch to the other queue and be 3rd, right? And when all those trades are made of people swapping queues, well, there's 6 in each one, in which case no one can trade and become better off. And that's an equilibrium outcome. And that's not a characteristic of a person, it's a characteristic of the system, the supermarket checkout system. And so that analogy is useful because there are 5 big equilibrium forces. And I'll rattle them off, and I hope people buy the book and dig into them, because they're very, very useful for understanding whether political promises about housing outcomes are plausible. So the first one is the asset price equilibrium. And that basically says there are multiple checkout queues where you can take $1 and swap it from a property asset into a share, into a government bond, put it in the bank, right? And what that means, that ability to swap assets, means that property prices can't just go up and they can't just go down by themselves because they're tied to the rates of return in all other asset classes in the economy. And we know this because when we reduce interest rates through monetary policy, we expect prices to go up because we're sort of lengthening the queue of putting money in the bank, so people switch from money in the bank into the housing queue, right? And so when we say, it's just supply and demand, that's why prices are high, we go, well, how does that fit with our asset price equilibrium? If prices are high, that means the rate of return per dollar in housing is low. Why would people keep buying housing instead of other assets in that case? Right? There is an economic force tying it to other markets. So, but then of course the question is, property prices can come down if rents go down. Okay, so the rental price is the second equilibrium. The cues for the rental equilibrium are, you can buy more housing, that's jump in this queue, or you can take that $1 and buy more other goods and services for your household. And what we see over time in New Zealand, as well as Australia and the UK, is essentially flat shares of income spent on rent. So in Australia, it was 20% in 1990, it was 20% in 2000, 20% in 2020. It's been a flat line. So despite all of this talk about rents rising unsustainably, they are doing what they always do, which is tracking incomes. Because if incomes rise and rents don't, what happens? Well, we take some dollars from consuming other goods and go, it's kind of weird that I've got a nice job and a nice car and go on holidays, but live in a terrible house in a bad suburb. Maybe I'll take some of those dollars and stick them into rent and move to a better house and a bigger house in a better suburb. And when we all do that, all of those trades take place. We get back to this equilibrium where we can't sort of get better off from switching from other goods into rent. And economists actually have a name for this, where the budget share you spend on a type of product stays fixed over time. We call that a normal good. right? There's inferior goods, luxury goods, and there's normal goods. And it's pretty funny that, this is the most normal thing in economic theory for this to happen with housing, but somehow we overlook it and we say things like, oh, rents would fall by 50% if this happened. Oh, rents could go down 30%. How can rents stay 30% lower? Wouldn't people move to that town because it's better? Wouldn't people move to bigger homes and outbid each other? It just can't happen. And if you look historically, that's why you get these flat lines. The third one, sort of hinted at, is the spatial equilibrium. You can always move to another location. So just like New Zealand and Australia, when Australia is booming, the spatial equilibrium says, well, if you can change supermarket checkout queues, if you can change cities, towns, or suburbs, you will do so until such time as there's no benefit. So moving equalizes quality of life, just like it equalizes the length of the checkout queue. And so what that means is, if a city goes, oh, we're going to upzone and prices are going to be really cheap here, how does that survive spatial equilibrium? Wouldn't people just plow into that town because you can make those incomes but pay less rent, and so your quality of life is better if you move there, and therefore it attracts more people, and then you sort of end up back to square one, where the quality of life is equalized between towns. And that's true not just between towns, but between suburbs and, of course, Australia and New Zealand to some degree. But the next one is density. So there's now we're talking about the supply of, or the provision, the development of new housing. And at that one point in time, when you build new housing, there is an equilibrium in terms of how many homes you put on that site, because the higher you go, the more it costs to get the extra dollar. And so the trade-off is, should I go higher or should I go slightly lower? And you do that until you equalize. And what that means is you maximize the net profits of a project by picking that density. And the higher the market price, the higher that density, which makes sense. That's why tall buildings are in accessible, high-value locations. It's also why at the end of property booms, we get the tallest buildings start construction. The Empire State Building. There's one in, I think, Kansas City at the moment in the US, tallest building in the US being proposed. Well, that's because prices went up a lot, so they justify tall buildings. But the point of this also is that you can only decide the density of a building at one instant point in time. Every building is the wrong density for the market because markets move continuously. And so the last equilibrium is the absorption rate. And this tells us how quickly over time, independent of the density of housing, that new homes will get built. And that equilibrium is all about trading off building today and building tomorrow. So those two supermarket checkout queues are build today and build tomorrow. Well, yeah, you can build more today, but if you can take some sales and some development from today and put it in tomorrow's queue and be better off, then you'll do it. And so there's a rate that optimizes the intertemporal trade-off over time. And that's why you see things like when prices are rising and markets booming, everyone tries to build homes all at once. And then when prices fall, everyone tries to stop building homes all at once, because they're all trading off this build today or build tomorrow dilemma. And when there's lots of people arriving, it pays to build much, much more a higher rate. And when lots of people aren't buying, it pays to build at a much slower rate. So when you have those five in your mind, it really helps to then unpick, well, what is possible with different policy settings. So that's why it's such a big, important part of the book.
That's great, Cameron. One of the schools of thought in New Zealand that we hear regularly is we just need to free up land and increase housing supply, and everything will be hunky-dory if we can just do that. And so we have to remove the red tape and zoning rules, etc., and get more houses built, and then, everyone will be able to afford a house. You don't appear to necessarily agree with this argument. Just wondering if you could explain your thoughts in this area.
Yeah, well, that's because their absorption rate equilibrium tells me that you cannot trick people into supplying faster than is optimal, just like you can't trick them into building taller than is optimal. So you can allow tall buildings, but in low value areas, no one's going to do it, right? We have a lot of places in Australia, regional towns, where we're trying to encourage density. We've got a place near Brisbane where I live that's got 90-metre height limits, and the tallest building's about 12 metres high. and it's had those limits for 20 years, but it's not worth building taller because the market price is so low there, right? You can't force people to do it. And so the absorption rate equilibrium says the same, but the rate per period of time of development. You can't force people to build faster if it's not economically viable. And so my observation of town planning systems in Australia and New Zealand is that there are many, many feasible sites that can be built today. And the thing that is regulating the pace of that is the absorption equilibrium. It's not that the regulatory constraint is binding, right? Because density is a different thing. And the regulations in the planning system are not regulations on how fast you can build. They don't say, oh, this zone, you can only build 5 dwellings per year. They say this zone, these are the densities you can build as quickly as you would like, right? If you apply for 10 approvals, I'll give you 10 approvals. You just build them. And so I think that's the confusion there. And in Australia, we have sort of buffer stocks of planned and approved dwellings, 40 and 50,000 of them in Brisbane where I live. And for apartments, we have, I think, a buffer stock of 60,000. If all the approved buildings were built today, there'd be 60,000, and we only build 1,000 a year or 2,000 a year, right? So it's clearly not the planning system that is regulating the pace of development. So that's why I just don't think there's going to be much change. And of course, it also, there's the spatial equilibrium to consider. Well, if one city does it, and, even if the absorption rate didn't apply, people would move there if it got cheaper until such time as rents increased back up to that share of income and the quality of life was no better from moving there. So, that's why I think it's so important to get the economics right, because you have to test whether your policy survives these economic forces or not. And I don't think upzoning does. Now, you can do it for urban design reasons, and I think there's a lot of outdated planning rules, right? Because it's 2024 and we can build different and better buildings than we could build in 1924. But we shouldn't expect that to radically change the price of dwellings, either rent or asset price.
In your book, you propose a public home ownership system named Housemate. Can you explain what this is and how it would operate? And also, just for a bit of New Zealand context, you're probably familiar with Kiwi Build, which was proposed under our previous Labour government, which would be fair to say didn't deliver as promised or hoped. So also, how would it differ from that?
Yeah, my understanding is Kiwi Build was sort of tasked with not doing subsidised housing. Is that right, Gareth? When it was initially created, it basically was given a budget and said, you have to cover your costs now. Let me just clarify before we...
Certainly they were, let's say, competitive pricing. They were certainly, houses were to be priced at a competitive market rate, so they weren't high top level prices. But I guess the key issue with Kiwi Build was that they pledged to build 100,000 new homes to address the housing shortage within 10 years. And I don't know where the numbers got to, but it's well short of 100,000, shall we say. So it was kind of more the scale of it that was the issue in New Zealand.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, it's very hard to ramp up a major construction project in the private sector or the public sector at any point in time. My understanding of Kiwi Build was this idea that you're going to just compete at market rents and you're going to still make money and not require subsidy was going to fail, because if it could be done, it would have been done by private developers, right? So there has to be a subsidy somewhere. And once you accept that fact, it becomes a very different story, right? You're just in the business of building lots of houses. This is like the post-Second World War European rebuild. They said, well, we're going to have to lose money because we have to build so quickly, right? So look, it's true that many public housing schemes take a while to kick off. After the First World War, we had the first soldier housing, and I think it was the governor of Victoria overpaid for land from his cousin, and then got his other cousin to do the construction and overpaid for that. And I think we can do better these days. The reason to propose this is simply that I couldn't find any examples anywhere in history or anywhere in the world where we'd sold housing for that group, that 10 or 15% of people who are renters who are getting squeezed every time the market adjusts and people's incomes are rising? I couldn't find any examples where those people's housing had been improved without a public option of some sort, whether that's regulated rental like Vienna, where there's massive council housing and it's somewhat universal, anyone can access it, or whether it's a public housing home ownership, which is more of a Singapore type approach. Europeans have this sort of long-term rental, but I think culturally the Australians and the Kiwis would go for a home ownership type approach. And we did actually subsidise a lot of people into home ownership after the Second World War. So in Australian cities, home ownership was around 40% in the 1930s. After the Second World War, we got it up to 71%. And we did that by essentially subsidising people into home ownership, right? And so I kind of, if I could find an easier way, I would find it. But unfortunately, you have to do the hard yards of organising an institution to manage getting people into cheap home ownership. Now, it's quite possible housemate could, you can either do all your projects yourself, like KiwiBuild, I think, tried to do everything themselves, or you can just say, hey, can you go out to tender? I'm looking to buy 100 homes in these suburbs at this price. Give us your best deal. Or you could show up at off-the-plan sales and just have a mystery shopper, just go and buy existing dwellings off the plan. Because at the end of the day, right, we have to accept the economics that there is a subsidy exactly equal to the difference between the market price and what you get people into that home at. There is no sneaking around this economically, right? So if KiwiBuild is not putting people into homes below market price, they're just building smaller or worse homes, then that's not a subsidy. That's just the same options they have in the market. Whereas, for example, in Singapore, you can buy a brand new apartment from HDB for, say, $350,000 that might sell for $1 million in the equivalent private market. And then you have requirements to live there for 5 years. You can't resell it for a period of time. You can't resell it in the free market. You have to sell it back to a qualifying buyer. But Singapore actually got home ownership from 20% to 88% in 2 decades through this type of scheme. So we know it's possible. We know it's not easy. We know there's going to be teething problems. We know you can't just start a developer and build 10,000 a year in New Zealand or 30,000 a year in Australia. But give it 5 or 6 years, get a process going, be flexible about the implementation. And just like schools, hospitals, and roads, it will happen. Like public roads are totally uncontroversial. We subsidize billions and billions of dollars a year, and we just expect, right? We just expect government agencies to come and fix everything, to operate the traffic lights, to do everything. Okay, that's great. Well, they can do everything all the way up to the front gate. Then suddenly they're incompetent, bumbling fools and can't build anything. Okay, well, maybe just get the main roads guys to build houses for you, right? I'm very pragmatic about the implementation. And if as I say to people, if I could find a way to just change zoning regulations and taxes and make housing cheap for those people, I would do it. Like, who wouldn't? It would be so easy. But I've spent, decades looking around, trying to understand housing, and in the last 4 years looking for examples around the world, and I just can't find them. I'm sorry. So we have to do it the hard way. But luckily for Australia and New Zealand, we already have high home ownership. So over the next 10 or 15 or 20 years, you only have to build up this public option to 10 or 15% of the market. Right? It doesn't have to be like Singapore where it's 85% of all dwellings. It only has to be small, and it can take a couple of decades. And then next property cycle, when rents rise 30% in a year, well, you'll only have 10 or 15% of people exposed to those rising rents instead of 30 or 35%. So you'll have half the problem, those cash flow issues faced by renters, and you'll have a whole lot more people in secure homes.
We'll swing back into to wrap up the politics of housing, because I think that is fascinating, and you were talking about that earlier. So, I mean, you note in your book that changing the market from its current equilibrium would mean someone must lose economically, and the electoral calculus falls heavily on the side of satisfying the majority who benefit from higher housing rents and prices. And, obviously, as you point out, and I noted our Prime Minister's among them, politicians are almost all property owners, and there's no political upside to falling house prices. And you also say there's no example anywhere in the world where cheaper house prices have been engineered politically, which is fascinating. Oh, well, the final point actually there was that you refer to two reliable ways to achieve major housing policy change. So can you just tell us about those? And then finally, does all this politics of it all mean that we are stuck with the status quo? And I guess if so, in a democracy, if it's what the majority want, is that bad?
Yes, is the short answer. But so I think I say the two reliable ways are war and regime change. And that's sort of demonstrating that because of this political bind we're in, with 2/3 of people being homeowners, the political class being homeowners, the only way to get change, there's got to be sort of existential political threat, right? Where you need to rally the troops, get every person on your side politically. You can't just keep playing these word games and making speeches where in the morning you promise renters that there'll be low rents, and then in the evening you go to the property council dinner and promise them high prices. Like only radical crisis, and what we're having right now is not a real crisis. Remember, it is just a 10 to 15% of the population crisis, and they need to be assured in the press that, my political party is looking out for you, while at the same time achieving nothing. They're the two historically effective ways to get major change. And that's why I suspect we won't get a lot of change in the market. What we will get is a market crash, because markets go in cycles, and they always have. And when we get that and prices come down and rents come down, it will become the number one political problem, right? When we actually get falling rents and prices, they become the number one political problem. That's what happened during COVID. It wasn't that long ago. I don't know what the New Zealand response was, but globally, we put interest rates down to zero. We handed money out to home buyers. We had the home builder scheme in Australia, where we subsidised people buying new homes and renovating. That's what we do when prices fall. And so I just can't square the idea that somehow we're going to change a tax here or a regulation there, and somehow we're going to get this result that we hate, that we panic when it happens. The market will change, it will correct. When it does, though, we'll drop interest rates and we'll bail out the current homeowners. Maybe that's a good time for those 10 or 15% of people to jump in and become homeowners. But if their incomes are unsecure and falling, they might not be able to either. So, look, this is the problem, right? I think we've got to accept the housing market's working for most people. The problem we properly defined is a small amount of people. And on the whole, politically, when prices fall, it becomes the biggest problem. So maybe there's a way to sidestep all that and just offer these people some kind of cheaper public option. And maybe that's the best we can do. And that's the sort of conclusion I get to in the book.
Well, look, Cameron, thanks a lot for that. It's a fascinating topic and close to the hearts of lots of people in New Zealand as it is in Australia. That's Cameron Murray, Chief Economist at Fresh Economic Thinking and author of a new book called The Great Housing Hijack. And I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz with another episode of our Of Interest podcast.